Fracking in the oil and gas sector has been getting some negative attention over the last number of years, with complaints that this poses a risk to water quality, air quality, the health of our ecosystem. Our guest today has done a study on this. Robert Murphy is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute think tank. So welcome to Bridge City News, Robert.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
You bet. Fracking, certainly a contentious issue, even in the U.S. presidential election these days. Leading Democrat candidate Senator Bernie Sanders says if he's elected, he would ban it nationwide. Some of the other candidates saying similar things. So, Robert, can you explain for our viewers in layman's terms what exactly is fracking, and also what are the economic benefits that this practice brings?
Well, sure. So actually, what people usually mean by fracking actually involves two separate things. So it's hydraulic fracturing, which is where the term fracking comes from, and that means just injecting water and other chemicals down into the ground and like into the pores between rocks to sort of open them up and loosen them up to allow the natural gas and oil to flow to the surface more easily. But the other technique that has been applied with is what's called horizontal drilling. And so those two things in conjunction are what has allowed what's we refer to now as like the boom in fracking. And so the benefits are just that it allows for producers in Canada and the United States to access more of the natural resources that are available there. Just to give an example, in Canada, the recent estimates show that of the marketable resources of natural gas, just over 70% are developed in terms of unconventional ones. And so the idea being that there's more than if you're looking at natural gas in Canada with fracking, it effectively more than doubles the amount that could be brought to market. So that's just to show again just the tremendous potential there from using this technique.
Yeah, that's very significant. You do the math on that for sure. So fracking, there are some definite economic benefits, but also potentially there's some risks involved with this as well. What is the history, I guess, of the complaints we receive about fracking? When did that start?
Well, I mean, right when it began, I think when it started, the boom in fracking took off. Some environmental groups, of course, began raising concerns. In the United States, I know that probably around 2012 is when it became a really big issue because Matt Damon, some of your viewers might know, he was in a movie, The Promised Land, that featured people that were victimized by big oil companies coming in and drilling, and then that things didn't go well. So I would say in terms of just the public awareness and what put this on the radar, that probably from 2012 onward, it seemed to be that people who were against climate change and are very concerned in those things, that fracking to them became a very serious issue.
Okay, and to be sure, again, there are some risks, so we'll take a look at some of those here. Now, you break it down into four myths, and so let's get started with that, I guess. Myth number one, and that is that fracking causes earthquakes. So yes or no? What do you say on that one?
So sure. So if what you mean by an earthquake is just a seismic event, then yes, it does do that. Because what you're doing is it's pumping water at high velocity, down into the ground, and depending on where you are in the state of the ground underneath, that can cause readjustments. So it is true. Some of the studies will show that yep, certain regions in the United States where fracking really took off, there's a lot more measured seismic events that they think are induced by the human activity. But then that term earthquake, I think, can be misleading, right? People have the idea that buildings are falling down. There has not been a single death in the United States attributed to an earthquake caused by fracking. Most of these things are very minor. In many cases, people might not even know that it happened. So they can detect it, but again, it's not as if bridges are falling down. So I think the term earthquake might be misleading, but yes, strictly speaking, by pumping the water in down there, they can disturb some of the motion.
Right, but we're not talking again, like you say, something that causes fatalities. Would you say in most cases then that these seismic events, slight tremors, I don't know what level they measure them at, calculate them at, but most people wouldn't even notice. Would that be correct?
I think that's a fair statement to say. The other thing too is, regardless of the degree of severity, that it's not fracking per se that causes it. That the latest
Okay.
research suggesting that if they just change the techniques, like as to how rapidly they pump the water in or the depth to which they pump it down in terms of the wastewater disposal, that could solve the problem. So again, it is an issue, but right now it's not as if there's significant damage. Like I say, there's no fatalities that have been attributed to it. And again, it's not that, oh yeah, we either have to choose fracking or this. It's you could continue to use these techniques to bring more natural gas to market and just change the way that they get rid of the wastewater.
Right. Again, you have to measure that risk benefit ratio, right? And now, would you say, would it be appropriate then for the government or the industry to put tighter regulations in place then for how they dispose of the wastewater?
Well, sure. So just to be clear, what I did in the study for the Fraser Institute is I just summarized the literature in terms of what the risks were. The one thing I'm very comfortable in saying is the outright provincial bans, like in Quebec and New Brunswick. I think that's overkill, right? And the analogy I would just use is driving a car has risks, but if provinces just banned cars altogether, that would clearly be the wrong thing to do. Now, when it comes to what should they do in response, again, it depends on costs and benefits. So certainly, what the literature shows, and as our discussion continues, I'll give you more specifics as to things they could do to minimize the impact. And I remain agnostic as to is this just something industry should comply with, or local governments enforcing it. A part of the problem is just there's different regulations in place, and I didn't want to weigh in on who should do what. I just want to summarize what the academic literature says about what the risks are and how to deal with it.
Okay. And I was reading here, ironically to me, that carbon capture and storage, due to the large net volumes of the injected fluids, may have potential for inducing larger seismic events. That's interesting.
Right, yeah, because again, it's the same principle that how could it be that human activity is going to cause an earthquake? It's, well, if we're injecting stuff down deep, it might disturb the rocks that are on how they sit on each other, and they might move. So yes, the some of the proposals for carbon capture and storage, yeah, it's capturing the CO2 as it's leaving a smokestack or whatever, and then injecting it down into the ground where it's not going to contribute to climate change. And ironically, yeah, that's the same mechanism by which people are concerned about fracking.
Yeah, okay. Well, myth number two, that is fracking threatens water quality and the availability of water as well. Now, and again, we hear the stories, right? And they're pretty cool stories. I mean, apparently this really happens. The stories of people lighting water on fire because it's mixed with methane gas. Is this because of, again, fracking? Do you want to address that?
Sure. So again, with this, there are cases where was contamination. So I don't want to misrepresent what happened to your viewers. But again, the systematic studies that we summarized in the article, and this is also too like meta studies, like reviews of the literature conducted by Canadian Council of Scientists, the U.S. EPA. They found that there's very modest risks, that there were a few cases, but relative to the number of wells that were in operation that were using fracking techniques, it was a very small proportion. And then even in the problem cases where they did identify and say yes, groundwater had been contaminated, for example, it wasn't again fracking per se. It was things like, okay, they had shallow pits where they were storing some of the wastewater, and they didn't line them, and so that's how it seeped in. So it was things like that where the fix would be, okay, do a better job of lining the pits for wastewater disposal, as opposed to just, okay, we can't use fracking anymore. So the big picture conclusion is that, yet there are risks, but it's the actual demonstrated harm was very small relative to how many operations were going, and the solution would not be to ban it outright.
So again, this is not the actual fracking, but does go, of course, hand in hand with it. So you have these shallow wells, and if they're too shallow, you're saying you have to line them properly so it doesn't leak into the groundwater here, correct? And how many people? I mean, if it isn't done properly, I mean, how many people are being affected by this? I mean, are we talking like, hundreds of people? Are we talking tens of thousands of people? What are we talking about here?
I can't give you a specific number because the literature is actually surprisingly vague. But again, the way they're describing it in the literature is it's very few isolated cases. Another consideration is one of the studies showed that yes, there was high methane concentrations, but they realized that that was just naturally occurring. That it's, in other words, it was a region where fracking had been going on. So again, with these things, it's a twofold process. That number one, is there problems with the water, and then is that because of the fracking or not? But again, all
Okay,
these
so
reviews are
just to
saying it's a
clarify,
small.
so in some of these areas, the methane that's there is not there because of the fracking, is just there naturally, and that sometimes does actually mix with the water, and then you can set your water on fire, I guess.
Right. So I don't know if it was the case of people setting their water, but you had, yes, and these were researchers who were skeptical of fracking, who they were surprised and said we have to admit these cases that we looked at, it wasn't the fracking causing it; it was just naturally the water in this area.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, okay, it's good to differentiate there for sure. Okay, and fracking, does it use too much fresh water? Right, again, there's a concern, right, for the environment. Do we have any stats on that? Whether using recycled water, as compared to fresh, what that ratio is like, to what degree are we using fresh water?
Yeah, I was trying to find a specific number for it, and I think it varies from operation to operate, and also the techniques have evolved over time. So I hesitate to give you a number. I do know though that there's a trade-off that, so it's true. I mean, a horizontally drilled well, just a single one can use something like 5 million gallons of water, for example. When all so that's just to give you an idea. But on the other hand, even though that sounds like a huge number compared to agriculture or electricity generation, fracking is still not a big user overall. The issue with using fresh water versus recycled is then if you use recycled water that reduces the strain on the fresh water, but then when they're re-injecting down to get rid of it, well then that's more problematic, right? You'd rather be using fresh water, so it's a
Right,
trade-off
because
in
that
terms of
could
the
then
two problems.
contaminate the groundwater,
Right.
right? So, okay, gotcha. And matter of fact, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency also did some studies on this as well, correct?
Right, exactly. Yeah, so that's a main feature that we did in the study, was just to go ahead and summarize what they did. And again, this was a 1,000+ page study that US EPA came out with, reviewing all the literature as of that day. I think it was a 2016 study. And again, they went in and they were saying yes, there are some issues, but overall, it doesn't seem like there's widespread impacts on drinking water quality.
Okay, so some perspective needed on this for sure. All right, another myth that you address here, you call it a myth, and that is, does fracking contribute to climate change, right? And now, certainly, again, we just, mentioned earlier that fracking does emit methane gas, which is, again, many people would see as a problem climate-wise.
Right. Yeah. So to be clear, so this isn't the methane in the water. This is the actual gas emitting from the operations. So yes, it is true that fracking does release methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. More potent than CO2. But even on that, if you adjust for or compensate for the amount of natural gas produced, fracking operations actually reduce less methane than conventional natural gas operations. So that's one thing. But the other huge consideration is natural gas displaces coal in terms of electricity generation. In the CO2 that it releases, natural gas is much cleaner in that respect than coal is. And so I would argue on net that fracking reduces, humankind's impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions overall.
Gotcha. So, a big picture, I mean, if you look at it narrowly and say, well, yes, this emits methane into the atmosphere, so therefore it's bad for the climate. But, big picture, if it's taking away a much worse offender, if you will, coal,
Mhm.
then will this actually contribute to, I guess, a positive to the whole climate change debate, right? So, yeah, I get what you're saying here. Interesting. Now, the other myth that you address is noise pollution, which is interesting. I mean, I guess if you live close by, is how bad is it, the noise?
Sure. So yeah, we addressed one study that I had found recently that measured that. They went to a certain opera. I think it was in Pennsylvania, and they went in, placed sound detection devices in homes that were located very near an operation, and they found, yep, you could, they could detect that there was operations nearby, but in terms of the volume, it was like a little bit louder than the hum of a refrigerator, but less of the volume than a normal conversation.
Hmm.
So again, you could tell that was going on, but it was no longer, it was no louder than a refrigerator.
Right. So I guess if you're living really close by and you're super sensitive to sounds, could be an issue. But big picture, is it worth banning fracking over the noise concerns? That would seem, well, to me anyway, seem somewhat unreasonable. Yeah. Okay. Now, there are some provinces, you mentioned earlier, New Brunswick, Quebec, they placed some moratoriums on fracking. Um, which is quite interesting because it's ironic when you look at what they're doing instead is importing U.S. natural gas, which is extracted from the ground through the use of fracking.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, big picture is not really helping, is it?
Well, certainly not in that sense that yeah, especially they're just getting it from somewhere else. And again, it's the idea there are risks here, but an outright ban to me just seems like it's clearly not the right solution. Again, because for each of these issues we've identified, there's ways that they can change the techniques they're using or the application of the fracking in order to minimize the risk. So an outright ban to me seems to be far too much of an overkill, especially to the extent that if climate change is the issue, because as we've said, it's fracking actually I think helps on climate change.
Hmm. Very interesting. Okay. Well, we're running out of time here. So again, I mean, I know you're loath to say, well, the government should make some changes here, but as you indicated earlier, it seems that either government and or the industry need to kind of put their heads together here and maybe adjust the regulations somewhat to make fracking safer than it currently is. Correct?
Right. Yeah, I think like a list of best practices, and I should
Yeah.
mention for all these things we mentioned, it's not that every operation is doing it. It's just there were some that were having these problems. So the ones that are being run more responsibly could be models for the others in the industry.
Right. Yeah. So we don't want to ignore the concerns, but we're saying let's get some perspective, big picture, and let's tighten things up, and we'll keep on using this to benefit the economy and even climate change, as you point out, that this can actually benefit. So, okay. Robert, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. You can read the study online at fraserinstitute.org. Robert Murphy is a senior fellow with the Fraser Institute think tank.